Good day, class. It is Mr. Sargent. I hope you're all doing well and had a good, safe, fun, restful spring break. I know it's unusual, far different from the spring breaks we normally have, but we are ready to move on to the rest of the year, really. This is the next unit of history, is the second to last that we're going to study this year. Before we move on to ancient China, I want to talk about ancient India for a moment, and I want to thank you for your great feedback. I know you guys really enjoyed that. I know you wrote that to me right before spring break. Found it very interesting, and for that reason, I think you're really going to enjoy this next unit on ancient China. Very similar in many respects, but also very unique in many respects. Let's start with this photo here. We have very interesting reds and oranges and yellows and cool architecture and things floating seemingly above these animals that are walking along. Looks like a city street. Hey, wait a minute, that's a parade, right? The lion's dance, part of a tradition in China for more than 1,000 years. Many of you have probably seen this lion's dance parade or one similar to it, be it in San Francisco, in the Chinese New Year parade, or maybe you've been to China itself, in the capital in Beijing where this photo was taken, and you've seen a similar parade. So this is a great photo because it shows really how intriguing the Chinese culture is, how deep and rich it is, how old it is, how colorful it is, and how much it's contributed to, in the past, to human history and to our modern day and where we're going, actually. So I think you're really going to enjoy this. And as you know, before we begin any study of any ancient civilization, we begin with, you got it, geography. So here we go. Which is how we always begin our next unit of study in history. Here you have China, which sits on the continent of Asia. You can see to the lower left on this picture, we have India, where we just came from. So we travel northeast to China. Now, all these colors, you know what these mean or should remember. The dark greens and light greens, those are some vegetation. This is a satellite image from space. I'm sure you could guess that. We've seen these before. The darker greens are forests, be it jungle or dense tree regions in central China. And then the lighter greens are typically grasslands. And then you have different browns, rocky, darker browns, and then the lighter sandy browns. And then on the left side, you see some spotting of white, which I think we've discussed before. That's snow, right? And why is it only in some places? Well, those are mountains, the tops of the mountains. And the blue, you guessed it, that's water. We have different bodies of water here. The main body of water is the Pacific Ocean on the right, and it's broken in that part of the world up into different bays and seas and different terms for smaller areas of the Pacific. But let's start talking about China itself and where it sits in the world and how that relates to its development. Now, China is isolated in many ways from the rest of the world. Not so much now, but especially in ancient times, because one, it was far from different regions, meaning Europe or even India, North America. It was just isolated by one. You could see here the blue. Here it is, the Pacific Ocean, right? That's one barrier to its east. That's the world's largest ocean, as we know. What about the other barriers? Another barrier is this set of mountains here, the Himalaya mountains. We've seen them before in India. You see this these are the tallest mountains in the world, as you know. Mount Everest is within that range. India here, China here. So very tall, important source of water, by the way, which we'll learn about later in our study in China. Now, the next barrier is this very mysterious, look at that, very light brown, looks sandy, desert area. That's one of the harshest deserts in the world. That is the Taklamakan Desert in western China. Very remote, very dry, extreme temperatures, very hard to cross. Another sandy area up here is the Gobi Desert, just south of Mongolia, part of northern China. Also very hot, also gets very cold in the winter, but very dry, most importantly. So, when you put all these together, what does it look like? This blue area acts as somewhat of a shield for China. If you are someone who wants to get into China, for good or bad reasons, it's hard to do that. So, if you are an invading army, let's say, it's very hard to get into China, especially in ancient times, through these barriers. Harsh deserts, high mountains. One area we didn't talk about is the Tibetan Plateau, by the way. And that's right here, right behind the Himalaya. It's very high altitude, flat but not much water. The area of Tibet, I should say, is right there. But that's still hard to cross. And then it's very hard to cross the Pacific Ocean without a very strong set of ships, right? So that acts as a very effective barrier. Now, not just armies, though. What if you're China, people in China, and you want to get out of China? Well, it's also very hard to do that because the same barriers act against trade, right? If you want to get out of China, it's tough to do that for the same reasons. You can, but it's just not an easy undertaking. So, what does all this mean again? This means that China is relatively isolated, especially in ancient times, from the rest of the world, which can be good because it offered protection for China for thousands of years to develop on its own, really, and develop a deep, rich, strong culture. But it also was hard to share some ideas with the rest of the world. And it wasn't until much later in history where you see widespread sharing with other parts of the world coming in and out of China. Let's talk about, let me erase this for a minute before we move on to the next slide. All this is good for understanding China's position on the planet, but we also want to know about what's actually inside China. And you can see there's a lot of green, so there are forests. There's dark and light green. And that means that there are grasslands, good areas to grow things. As you know from our study of other ancient cultures, you need to have good arable or land, farmable land. And fortunately, that's what China has. Check out these two rivers. One river, as you'll read in Nat Geo, is the Huanghe River. Huanghe. I know it looks like Huanghe, but it's Huanghe. It's in the north. And it generally follows a course something like this. That's the Huanghe River. And you can see that it is near these desert areas. These desert winds blow this silt that we saw like in Mesopotamia, this yellow silt, a very fertile, fine soil. The winds blow it into the river, and then the river carries it into the farm areas, and it becomes a very rich farm area right there. You could grow a lot of great crops in that region along the Huanghe. However, as we saw with the Nile, the Tigris, the Euphrates, there are times of the year when a river like that becomes dangerously full. Becomes dangerously full and starts flooding. And it could be very dangerous for farmers or villagers or city dwellers in those types of areas. So you kind of have to put up with that if that's where you want to grow food and make a living. Now, the other river, major river within China, is called the Changjiang River or Yangtze River. That is further to the south, and it runs, hopefully you can see that, basically along this course. And yes, it's good for farming, but it doesn't really flood as much. And it always follows the same course. So thousands of years, that river has run along that, generally that same course, unlike the more wild, flood-prone river to the north, the Huanghe. The Changjiang River down here, Changjiang, because it was more predictable, allowed for more, not only more farming, but these are arrows, right? You could trade all along here because the river was predictable. You could send boats up and down, trading throughout central China. So you can see these two main rivers going out to the Yellow Sea, the East China Sea, which are smaller parts of the Pacific. The area between those is really where we have the heartland of China right here. It's called the North China Plain. The North China Plain in that red area. And that's where the first ancient Chinese civilizations began, right in that area. So you'll read about the different dynasties or ruling families that we've heard about before. That's all where that historical activity began, and then China expanded outward from there. Okay? So, hopefully you understand that point about isolation in China and how that affected Chinese cultural development. Again, you see the North China Plain, that's on this map here in Nat Geo. You see that's where the Chinese culture began. And then we have this shield that I talked about that isolates in a helpful way, but also in a problematic way. And China had to overcome that and still has to overcome that to this day. So fascinating stuff. We are going to go on and do an assignment now in Google Classroom. I think you're going to like it because you're going to get to use not only this video, but also the Nat Geo text. And there are several questions that you're going to have to do. You're going to get to pick certain areas that you want to explore more. And and then give some interesting reasons behind your thinking. So again, this is the foundational stuff. I think you're going to like it. And here we go with ancient China. All right. If you have any questions, be sure to email me or Google chat, and we'll work these out together. And I look forward to talking with you. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.